How wonderful it is to be in worship this morning. We're winding up the series of sermons, the Gospel According to Dogs. Remember, gospel is the word that means good news. And good news also comes with a challenge each time. We talked a couple of weeks ago about the good news that God has gifted and graced us, given us talents and abilities that are unique to each person. And the challenge of that is to use what God has given you. And last week we talked about the trustworthiness of God, the good news of the trustworthiness of God and the abundant life that Jesus came to give us. And the challenge of that is to trust and obey, to trust in God and to obey the way that Jesus set out for us. And we sang it in the hymn, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And today, our good news is the unconditional love of God that we heard beautifully expressed a moment ago by Mr. Mark and by Mr. Mark's helpers who shouted out the good news. But there's a challenge with the good news too, and that is the challenge of Jesus when he calls us to love unconditionally. And that's our good news and our challenge for today. So in this series, of course, we're using dogs. To some extent, I suppose we're projecting on our dogs human traits. But even more important than that, we are learning from our dogs traits that come naturally to them that perhaps don't come so naturally to us as humans. Maybe we have to work a little bit harder on those things. When we describe our dogs, we usually use words like faithful and trusting and friendly. But almost always, somewhere in the conversation, a dog lover will talk about the unconditional love of a dog. This is a plaque that actually belongs to Elaine Johnson, but my wife Susan bought one of these for me recently. It says, "To have a dog is to know what it's like to be unconditionally loved." These are the sorts of things that dog lovers manufacture and purchase. Unconditional love. Love unconditionally. It's the good news of unconditional love, and it is the challenge of loving unconditionally. Jesus said in those words we heard a moment ago that we are to love even as God loves. Now, when we look at our dogs, there are stories that abound that speak of unconditional love. All of us can talk about the stories of what it's like to be greeted by our dogs, those of us who are dog lovers. We can experience a dog pulling on the leash to come and greet us, a stranger, just because dogs want to make that kind of connection. But sometimes there are outstanding stories of unconditional love, in fact, self-sacrificing love. You might have heard the story of Lily. Lily is a pit bull who was rescued from a shelter by a man named David Lantain. David rescued Lily to give to his mother Christine, and you could put it this way, in order to rescue Christine. Because Christine had a problem with depression, Christine had a problem with loneliness, Christine began to self-medicate with alcohol, that problem that she had. Her son was very concerned about her, and so he gave her Lily. And Lily really transformed her in many ways. They became very close. Lily was her constant companion. They went everywhere together. And she began to pull herself out of some of the depression that she was experiencing. She even went and received professional help. She recognized the need, and her life was much better with Lily. One evening in May in 2012, she took Lily for a walk, or Lily took her for a walk. You know, it can work both ways. And they were out walking, and she decided to go and visit a friend, and she went a farther distance to visit this friend. The friend offered her a drink. She had not had anything to drink for a long time. And she at first turned it down, but the friend poured a drink anyway, and she had a drink, and that led to another, and that led to another, and that led to another. She became intoxicated, and sure enough, Lily ended up walking her toward home. And as they made their way and crossed a railroad track, Christine fell, and she passed out, and she was on the track, and a train was coming. True story. Lily began to pull and to try to do everything she could to get her off of the track, but to no avail. And she was pulling and tugging and trying to rouse her, and she could not do it. The engineer reported that he saw the movement of the dog on the track and began to slow the train down. As he saw that in the distance, he realized there was a person there, and so he slammed on the brakes. And of course, it takes a long time to stop a train, and so the train came to a stop, but a little bit too late for Lily, who was injured severely. She survived, but it did stop short of hitting Christine. When the engineer got out of the train and went down there, he saw this severely injured dog who had moved over to be beside her owner, Christine. They called the paramedics. Christine was okay. Lily severely injured. She recovered. She lost her front right leg, and she became hailed as a hero. She has her own website with several 100,000 followers. Lily, the pit bull. It's a story that's told to say something about the nature of the love of a dog and the loyalty of a dog, and even the willingness to sacrifice herself. It's an amazing thing. There's nothing in a dog's evolution that would automatically think would lead to that. There's nothing in the instincts that are self-preservation instincts that would make you expect such a thing, but we read those stories over and over again, that kind of amazing love and loyalty and faithfulness to their owners. And so we use that as a kind of framework to think about this call on our lives, the unconditional love of God and the call on our lives. Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you or harass you, it says in the translation we heard today. He goes on to say, for in doing so, you will be acting like a child of God, who sends the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, sends the sun to shine on good and evil alike. If you love those who love you, well, what more are you doing than anyone else? What good is that? Everyone does that, even the tax collectors, Jesus says. If you greet only your brothers and sisters, so what? Even the pagans, the Gentiles, do that. But then Jesus says, you are to love as God loves. The way he puts it is, you are to be perfect, it says in most translations. A better translation, as in the one we heard today, you are to be complete in showing love to everyone as God is complete in showing love to everyone. That is a tall order for us. Something that seems to come somewhat naturally to dogs is something we have to work on. Something we have to remember and remind ourselves of. Something that takes work for us. I read this article that I just want to share with you because I think it's so well done. It's written by David Anderson not long after the terrorist attack in Orlando. And I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that golden retrievers, who are comfort dogs, were brought in to be of comfort in that situation. And so he wrote, in response to that, he wrote an article called God, Dogs, and Unconditional Love. Let me read that to you. On the Monday following the terrorist rampage in Orlando, a dozen golden retrievers showed up in the Disney city. They were part of the Canine Comfort Dogs team, a ministry run by Lutheran Church Charities. The dogs had come to give the kind of love and comfort that come only from a furry friend. There was a time when bringing in dogs to care for the emotional needs of the traumatized would have seemed odd, but now it's common. Canine Comfort Dogs came to the emotional rescue after the Boston Marathon bombing, after the Sandy Hook shootings. We've had a lot of people here that start petting the dog and they break out crying, said Tim Hetzner, president of the charity. And then he said, dogs show unconditional love. Unconditional love, the article continues, is a near cliche. People use those words as if it happens rather naturally, but in actual practice, that kind of love comes easily for God and golden retrievers and very grudgingly for human beings. Our love comes with a lot of conditions, a lot of strings. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It means we're just human. Yet, the one thing every soul seeks is simply that unconditional love, where there is nothing to be earned. So, when I read stories about golden retrievers being flown in to offer stringless love to grieving humans, I can't tell whether that's a beautiful thing, how we finally understood the emotional and spiritual capacity of our pets, or whether we have outsourced our love needs to animals because we can't find a way to do it ourselves. Perhaps the best thing we can do is recognize how hard it is to offer unconditional love. That way we can start working on our love life. Selfless love, agape Jesus called it, doesn't come naturally. It takes work and practice. We have to find some way to unplug the mind, which is a non-stop judging machine, and move deeper into the heart. All the caveats that cling to our loves come from the unchecked mind. The saints of all time and every tradition have committed themselves to some daily practice that moves a man or woman out of the hamster wheel in the head and into the depths of the heart, where I can see all the limits I put on my love, and there I can choose another way. And listen to how he ends his article. The only beings who naturally offer unconditional love are either God or dogs. If you're a human being, the only way to get there is through a lot of inner work and a flood of grace. A lot of inner work and a flood of grace. So I want to close with a story. It's the story of Belker, the wolfhound. A veterinarian was called to the family, Belker's family, a family that had been together for 10 years. Belker was 10 years old and very ill. The veterinarian, a family friend, came to see about Belker and unfortunately gave the family the news that Belker would not survive. And the next day, when the end came for Belker and Belker was breathing his last, the family was gathered around. Ron and Lisa, the parents, and the little son, Shane, 4 years old. They were all there. And after Belker had died, they were astounded at how composed Shane was. After all, Belker had been someone Shane had known literally all of his life. He had been a part of the family, of course, and deeply loved and loving. And yet he seemed at peace somehow. They began to talk about the lifespan of dogs and how dogs typically don't live as long as people typically do. The lifespan of a person is much longer, wondering why it is that way. Why is it that dogs have to die so much sooner than people generally do? And Shane, the 4-year-old, said very boldly and confidently, "I know why." And it startled everyone, and they turned to hear what he had to say. And he said this. He said, "People are born so that they can learn to live a good life, like loving everybody all the time and being nice." And then he said this, "Well, dogs already know how to do that, so they don't have to stay here as long." Those last sentences of that article I read a moment ago speak to that. The only beings who naturally offer unconditional love are either God or dogs. If you're a human being, the only way to get there is through a lot of inner work and a flood of grace. We come to worship. We go to Bible study. We share with one another because we want to do that inner work that it takes to love as Jesus calls us to love, that difficult work. And we come seeking God's grace that gives us the ability to love. The grace that reminds us of God's deep, unconditional love for us, and the grace that empowers us to go and do likewise. We come to the Lord's table as a reminder of all that God has done for us in Jesus, and of that gift and that call on our lives. Amen.